The iron chains bite into her ankles, cold and unforgiving against skin that has not felt the warmth of the sun in weeks. Through the narrow, barred window of her cell, she can hear the rhythmic thud of a hammer striking wood. Thud, thud, thud. It is the sound of the carpenter building the execution platform in the market square. But the flames are still days away. What happens between the accusation and the execution? The hidden days of terror that history often glosses over would prove far more terrible than the fire itself. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft across Europe and the American colonies. Most were women. Most were innocent. And every single one of them endured a systematic dismantling of their humanity long before the executioner lit the pyre. The knock on the door came without warning, usually just as the sun was reaching its peak, ensuring the maximum number of eyes would witness the spectacle. Across Europe, the arrest of a suspected witch wasn't a legal procedure. It was public theater designed to terrorize. Local authorities, flanked by stern-faced ministers or priests holding crosses like weapons, would seize the accused in broad daylight. This was the first act of psychological warfare. The journey from her home to the holding cell became a gauntlet of abuse. Villagers who had known the accused for decades, people she had bought bread from, whose children she had helped deliver, suddenly transformed into a mob. They spat. They threw refuse. They hurled accusations that defied logic but fed the hunger for a scapegoat. The transformation from neighbor to pariah didn't take days. It happened in minutes. In German territories, under the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina of 1530, the legal system was rigged from the start. Judges could initiate prosecution on their own authority, meaning the accused was subject to a magistrate who served simultaneously as investigator, prosecutor, and judge. There was no impartiality here, only a relentless drive to purge evil. Women formed roughly 80% of those accused. Most over the age of 40, they were midwives who knew the secrets of birth and death, healers whose herbs worked a little too well, widows without male protection to speak for them, or simply women with sharp tongues who had made the wrong enemies. The accusations followed predictable patterns: cursing a neighbor's cow, consorting with the devil in the woods, causing crop failures with a glance. In a world where a bad harvest meant starvation, misfortune demanded an explanation, and the witch provided a convenient vessel for collective rage. Before any trial could even begin, the accused faced deliberate, calculated public degradation. The stocks and the pillory stood in every town square, like grim monuments to social order, wooden frames that immobilized victims by their ankles, wrists, or necks. Locked in the stocks, the accused ceased to be a person and became public property. Passers-by were not just allowed to abuse them, they were encouraged. It was a civic duty. Rotten vegetables were the kindest projectiles. Refuse. Animal waste. And mud mixed with sharp stones all found their way to the defenseless figure trapped in the wood. Some remained in the stocks for days, denied food or water, forced to soil themselves while crowds jeered and children laughed. It was a physical manifestation of their social exclusion. You are filth, and you will sit in filth. The pillory added another dimension of suffering to this public shaming. With head and hands thrust through wooden holes, victims stood bent forward in agonizing positions for hours on end. Their backs screamed, their legs cramped. But they could not move. The crowds could turn violent in an instant. Stones thrown with malicious intent could break teeth or blind eyes. Several victims perished right there in the square, their necks broken by a sudden surge of the mob, or their bodies giving out from exposure and trauma. Heavy iron chains bound their wrists and ankles when they were finally dragged away. Prisoners were paraded through the streets in these restraints, their shuffling progress drawing fresh crowds who wanted to see the devil's whore. The psychological impact was calculated and complete before they killed her body. They had to kill her dignity. But the public humiliation was just the appetizer. With the accused already broken by shame, authorities turned to tests, cruel, pseudo-scientific experiments designed to prove guilt through divine judgment. The most infamous was the swimming test, derived from ancient practices and twisted by Christian theology. The logic was deadly simple. Water, being the pure element of baptism, would reject those who had rejected God. Innocence meant drowning. Guilt meant survival. The accused would be stripped to her undergarments, her thumbs tied to her opposite toes in a painful, unnatural position. A rope around her waist supposedly allowed for rescue, but accidental drownings were common. Then, she was cast into the nearest pond or river like a sack of stones. If she sank, she was innocent and likely dead. If she floated, the water was rejecting her, proving she was a witch. This test ignored physics entirely. Clothing trapped air, creating buoyancy. Natural body fat varied. Panic caused people to thrash and stay afloat. But to the witch hunters, these were signs of Satan's power. Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed witch-finder general of England, used the swimming test extensively during his terror campaign from 1644 to 1647, sending hundreds of women to their watery or fiery graves based on whether they could float. But the water was not the only weapon. Pricking for the devil's mark represented another grotesque practice. Folklore claimed that Satan marked his servants with a spot that felt no pain and would not bleed a teat to suckle his familiars. The accused would be completely unclothed and examined before a panel of witnesses, usually men, who scrutinized every inch of her body. Then began the systematic testing with sharp implements, long needles, bodkins, or pins. Professional prickers emerged, traveling from town to town, charging fees to find these marks. Many were frauds who used retractable needles that slid back into the handle when pressed against the skin, never piercing the flesh, never drawing blood, and thus proving the woman was a witch. The victim, tested dozens or hundreds of times with these needles, had no defense against a rigged game. Every mole, every scar, every birthmark became a potential death sentence. Even the simple act of reciting scripture became a trap. The prayer test demanded that the accused recite the Lord's Prayer without a single stumble or stutter. Any hesitation, any mispronounced word was recorded as proof that the devil was choking her, preventing holy words from passing her lips. In a high-stress environment, exhausted, terrified, and often uneducated, who among them could perform perfectly? Isolation and starvation were the next tools in the arsenal. Designed to break the spirit before the body? Medieval prisons weren't places of rehabilitation. They were holding cells where human beings were reduced to shadows. Stone-walled dungeons. Small, and damp, held the accused in nearly complete darkness. Sanitation did not exist. Human waste accumulated in the corners. Rats and vermin thrived, biting at the prisoners' sores. Cold penetrated deep into their bones in winter, while summer heat turned the cells into suffocating ovens. Food and water came irregularly, designed for survival, not sustenance. A crust of moldy bread, a cup of stagnant water. Many found themselves abandoned by their own families, their relatives too frightened of being accused themselves to bring food or comfort. Starvation worked slowly, weakening bodies and confusing minds, making them more susceptible to the interrogator's suggestions. Heavy iron shackles remained in place throughout imprisonment, chained to the stone walls. Sleep became torture. The constant weight of iron left deep wounds on wrists and ankles that festered and rotted in the filth. Isolation magnified every horror. Days and nights blurred into an endless, terrifying darkness. The only company was the prisoner's own spiraling thoughts and the occasional visit from a torturer. When isolation failed to produce the desired confession, authorities escalated to direct torture. Under inquisitorial legal systems, a confession was often required for a conviction. Since witchcraft was a spiritual crime that left no physical evidence, torture became the essential tool for obtaining the necessary admissions. The legal frameworks provided detailed, chilling prescriptions for when and how torture could be applied. The Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, written in 1486, stressed the importance of confession while noting the stubborn silence of witches. Torture was justified as a holy necessity to overcome the demonic influence that supposedly sealed the witch's lips. Sleep deprivation was the most common method, used extensively because it was effective, left no visible marks, and required no complex machinery. The accused would be kept awake for days, 40 hours, 60 hours, sometimes more through constant questioning, prodding with sharp sticks, or being forced to walk endlessly back and forth in their cell until their feet bled. Interrogators worked in shifts, fresh and rested, while the victim withered. After sufficient time without sleep, the mind began to fracture. Hallucinations emerged. Shadows turned into demons. Simple questions became incomprehensible. Resistance crumbled into delirium. Many confessed to anything flying on broomsticks, kissing the devil's backside simply to be allowed a few moments of sleep, knowing full well that confession meant death. But finding the prospect of death preferable to one more hour of torment, when psychological torture wasn't enough, they turned to the mechanics of pain. The strappado was a favored technique. It involved tying the victim's hands behind their back and hoisting them into the air by their wrists using a pulley system. The geometry of the human body is not designed for this. The shoulders gave way immediately. The sudden separation of the joint, producing an agony that never faded. The victim would hang suspended, their own body weight, creating relentless, tearing pressure on the dislocated joints. Sometimes, to speed up the process, heavy weights were attached to the legs, increasing the strain until the muscles tore. The torture could be prolonged for hours, with the victim being raised and dropped repeatedly, stopping just inches from the floor to wrench the damaged shoulders further with a sickening jerk. The rack represented the most infamous torture device of the era. Victims were tied to a wooden frame by their wrists and ankles. then stretched as rollers pulled their limbs in opposite directions. The pain began as unbearable pressure in the joints, then escalated beyond comprehension as ligaments snapped and bones popped from their sockets. The torturer could control the speed with a ratcheted wheel, making the stretching gradual or sudden. Anne Askew, a noblewoman condemned for heresy in 1546, endured the rack in the Tower of London until her body was so broken she could no longer walk. She had to be carried in a chair to her execution at the stake, her limbs useless, but her spirit unbroken. Thumbscrews. Simple but devastatingly effective. Compressed the fingers or toes between metal plates studded with small protrusions. The design prevented victims from passing out from blood loss while ensuring prolonged, localized agony. Interrogators could gradually increase the pressure, crushing the nail beds and eventually the bones, making each question more unbearable than the last. The screws would be tightened slowly, allowing time for answers between each turn that brought fresh waves of nausea-inducing pain. Under such conditions, confessions became inevitable. But torture did not end with a simple admission of guilt. Authorities demanded more. They wanted names. They demanded the names of other witches. Descriptions of the Sabbaths attended. Detailed accounts of pacts made with Satan. The accused, desperate to end their suffering, would implicate neighbors, friends, even family members. This created cascading accusations that spread witch hunts through entire regions like a virus in Bamberg, Germany, between 1626 and 1631. Approximately 900 people were burned after torture produced ever-expanding lists of conspirators. Each confession led to new arrests. Each new arrest to fresh torture. Each torture to more names. It was a self-perpetuating machine of death that consumed entire towns. After weeks or months of this suffering, the accused finally faced the flames. But even execution was designed as a public spectacle and final degradation. Burning at the stake was reserved for heretics and witches across continental Europe. The punishment carried profound religious significance. A burned body could not be resurrected on Judgment Day, condemning the witch to eternal oblivion along with temporal death. The symbolism was deliberate. Fire purified. It destroyed not just the body, but any trace of the corruption that had supposedly infected it. In some regions, those who confessed and showed repentance were granted the small mercy of being strangled before the fire was lit. Others faced the flames fully conscious. The execution platform was erected in the town's central square, ensuring maximum visibility. Construction began days in advance. The sound of hammering a constant reminder to the imprisoned of what awaited them. Crowds gathered hours before the scheduled execution, claiming the best vantage points, bringing food and drink as if attending a festival. What followed was carefully orchestrated theater designed to reinforce social order through the most visceral demonstration of power imaginable. The condemned was led to the stake in a procession that transformed their final walk into a public ritual of shame. Often they were dressed in special garments, yellow sackcloth painted with demons and flames, or forced to wear signs listing their offenses. The crowd's reaction varied. Some jeered and threw objects. Others watched in stunned silence, perhaps wondering if they might be next. All were bound to the wooden post, their bodies lashed tight with wet ropes or chains to prevent escape or even movement as the fire took hold. The method of burning varied significantly by region, each variation carrying its own specific horror. In some areas, wood was piled loosely around the victim's feet, allowing flames to overtake them slowly from below. This method could take considerable time. The victim remaining conscious and screaming as the fire advanced up their legs and torso. The crowd would hear everything, see everything. The spectacle serving as the ultimate deterrent against nonconformity. In other regions, particularly in Germany and parts of France, wood and straw were stacked high around the entire body, creating a hut-like structure. This was designed to hide the victim's suffering from the spectators while intensifying the heat. This created a more complete inferno that killed more quickly, but also prevented the crowd from witnessing the full extent of the victim's final moments, a mercy for the viewer. Perhaps, but a lonely terror for the dying. A third method involved binding the victim to a ladder that was then swung into an existing bonfire. Combining the sudden shock of immersion with the sustained burning, the agony defied description. Smoke inhalation sometimes brought death before the flames overtook them, a mercy when it occurred. The victim would suffocate from the thick, acrid smoke, losing consciousness before feeling the full extent of the fire consuming their flesh. More often, however, victims remained conscious as the flames licked at their skin. Their screams filled the square, echoing off the surrounding buildings. A sound witnesses would carry with them to their own graves. Joan of Arc, burned in 1431 in Rouen, reportedly died from smoke inhalation before the flames fully reached her, though this small grace came only after she had already endured months of imprisonment and a politically motivated trial. Not all regions burned witches. In England and the American colonies, hanging was the standard method of execution for convicted witches. Legal traditions dating back centuries specified hanging for felonies, and witchcraft fell under this category. During the Salem witch trials of 1692, 19 people were hanged on Gallows Hill, their bodies left to swing as grim warnings against the setting sun. But one man, Giles Corey, suffered a different fate entirely. He refused to enter a plea, neither guilty nor not guilty, knowing that if he was convicted, his land would be seized by the state, and his family left destitute. To force a plea, the court ordered peine forte et dure, pressing by heavy stones. They laid him on the ground, placed a board over his chest, and piled rocks upon it. For 2 days, they added weight. His only words, uttered with his dying breath as his ribs cracked and his lungs collapsed, were a defiant, "More weight." He died without pleading, saving his family's inheritance, but paying the ultimate price in agony. Bodies were often left on display after execution. In cases of burning, ashes might be scattered into rivers or buried in unmarked graves, denying the victim a proper Christian burial and erasing their final trace from the earth. The true horror of the witch trials lay not just in the fire or the rope, but in their systematic nature. Communities transformed neighbors into monsters through procedures that revealed humanity at its absolute darkest. Fear, superstition, and malice combined to create a machinery of persecution that destroyed tens of thousands of lives. Every stage was documented, regulated, and approved by authorities who believed they were serving justice. These women and men were not witches. They were victims of their neighbors' fears, their community's need for scapegoats, and legal systems that demanded confessions regardless of truth. When you consider the suffering inflicted on accused witches before they ever reached the flames, ask yourself, which was more terrifying, the community's willingness to torture their neighbors, or their absolute insistence that they were the good guys. The fires that consumed the accused have long since turned to ash, but the machinery of persecution they represent never truly disappeared. It just waits for the next spark.